Hey, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom, and in today's video, we are joined by Dr. Marc Barnes. Mark, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing fabulous. Thanks for asking, Dom. How about yourself?
Wonderful. I'm doing great. Thanks again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no.
Um, yeah, I really enjoy you guys' work at New Polity. Speaking of which, could you maybe give an introduction of who you are and the work you guys are doing in general?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Marc Barnes. I'm the editor of New Polity magazine. It's a quarterly journal of political philosophy and theology that tries to imagine what a Christian social order looks like, especially in the demise of liberalism, our current world order. And I'm also a student, or rather, I'm just about done being a student. Did my PhD at St. Mary's in Twickenham in London on questions of gender, and very happily turned in all the corrections and defended the dissertation. And at some point they're going to put a hat on me, and that'll be it.
Excellent. Okay, well, today's topic, of course, is going to be gender, which is what you wrote your dissertation on.
Yes.
Uh, Quite a fascinating topic, especially today. And speaking of today, I think a good way to kick off this conversation would be to ask you about the landscape today when it comes to gender, specifically queer theory, and specifically Judith Butler, who seems
Oh,
to be the authority in this area to most people. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about Judith Butler and what queer theory is?
yeah. So Judith Butler, God bless her, is the kind of mother of queer theory in this regard. Though I suppose the mother epithet might rub her the wrong way. She wrote the wonderful work Gender Trouble in 1990, which kind of she'd done quite a few things before that, but
Mhm.
it really gave concrete expression to the cliche we often hear: gender is just a social construct. It gave that weight, it gave that a defense. It actually didn't really end up arguing that gender was just a social construct. I think there's a big difference between what Butler was arguing and then how it kind of matriculates or trickles down, I should say, into culture.
Mhm.
Um, but she was the first, I think, to really phrase it in a kind of movement defining way with Gender Trouble. And then she went on in all of her subsequent books to make distinctions and to try to strengthen the position laid out in Gender Trouble, which is essentially that male and female, being female, being a man, being a woman, is only apparently what she calls a natural kind. That is to say, something that we have as a reality, as a gift, you might say as an essence coming from a certain tradition. But I think you can kind of boil it all down to the idea that man is created as male and female, or at least has that being of male and female in the manner of someone created, if you're going to sort of try to get around a question of God's intention here. Um,
Mm.
so, so she says, it is not so. You have heard it said unto you that gender is a natural essence. I say unto you that it is in fact what she calls a performative act. And the simplest way to understand this is just that gender is something that you do. You
Mm.
create the appearance of being this fixed, solid entity called man or woman by the repeated performance of certain actions, which have the effect of producing that appearance. So, to put it very simply, and I don't think she means it this simply, but it helps. You know, it's not that women exist and then wear dresses. It's that the performative act of wearing dresses produces the appearance of this stable reality we call woman. And so that's obviously she's not saying it's simply dresses. For her,
Right.
really the entirety of the political and cultural reality of power um, forces people who live under the reality of political and cultural power to adapt their behavior in such a way as to produce this stable appearance of being a man or a woman. It's necessary for our survival. It's necessary for us being understandable within our world. However, she
Mhm.
strips it of any ontological necessity. So this is a necessity that comes with um, living within a social world with other human beings. It's not a necessity that comes with the nature. the way we are created.
Gotcha. So yeah, so we see that she is in the postmodern tradition here. Power, politics, and social constructs. Now, I know this is a very big topic, and we're only brushing the surface here. But a response to this that we see more usually on the conservative side is that gender is biological,
Mm.
and that a man has a penis, a woman a vagina, and the chromosomes are different. And so why are we even talking about this? Get back to reality. Is that a good answer to Judith Butler's way of setting things forth?
No, I think, in fact, not only is it anticipated and answered in Judith Butler's own work, but it, to my mind, just kind of sounds like more Judith Butler. It's just that the things that make the man and make the woman are different. Now, I am not at all denying that gender, or I prefer to just say, like, the reality of man and woman is a biological reality. But what you see from this idea of using what I call biological trump cards to indicate a real existence of a man or a woman beyond any doubt, whether that's male and female anatomy, male and female sexual chromosomes, is a deep confusion, I think, about the meaning of the parts of man and woman in relation to the whole. Another way to put this is that if there's an argument that the penis maketh the man, right? Then what we need to question is it the case that our anatomy is constitutive of our being a man? That is to say, does it make us a man in a literal sense? Or are we saying something more to the effect of there is a mystery that's created, and we call this man, and that the penis or sexual chromosomes are a way of expressing this reality that obviously infinitely exceeds what those parts can express? Is the whole greater than the parts? Now, the thing that I see the biological conservative sort of rhetorical arguments, the thing that I see that they have in common with the Butlerian arguments is mechanical philosophy. And this is basically the idea, or a mechanical view of nature. And this is really tough for Americans because we've had this in our blood. It's basically the view that begins really with, well, it's always there, but Francis Bacon really gives it sort of new legs, and it really takes off within American culture. But it's basically the idea that a thing is reducible to the parts that make it up, right? So you ask me what a man is, and I say, well, look, you're going to have a fetus that has these sexual chromosomes, which stimulate this kind of andronizing hormonal in utero environment, which is going to develop this fetus in this particular way. And then the results are going to be this anatomy, and that is a male. Which obviously there's a lot of hope invested in these arguments because it makes them on the basis of an investigatable material reality. I can prove you're a man because a man is the sum of all of these male parts. Therefore, I can investigate you I can consider you as a human. I can put your being a man or being a woman in doubt, and then I can investigate your parts. And if the parts meet these criteria, then you're a male. And this is obviously what I think gives this a lot of, it's not often that you find the kind of left, to put it broadly, lacking the power of science, it seems like, and then the right having it. So there's obviously a lot of glee in saying, like, we have science on our side. Look at us investigate these the parts to find out what the whole is. And I do think in some ways there's something more sensible about doing that, right? Like, the parts do express something, but it is a different thing to say these parts express this mystery, which is a whole that exceeds them, and to say these parts are constitutive of the whole. And I think that's the fundamental conundrum that the conservative sort of reaction to the postmodern questions has.
It sounds like if you say that, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Oh, it's gone. It sounds like if you say that if the parts are constitutive of the whole, you're kind of reducing the whole to the parts.
Yeah.
But if you say the parts express the whole, then you're more open to the transcendent here. And
Yeah.
that's much more Catholic, much more sacramental, it sounds to me.
Well, I sure think so, though I've had as much argument from Catholics against this sort of line of
Yeah.
thinking as others. I mean, one of the things to look at is, certain intersex conditions which really do trouble the mechanical description of man and woman. Like when there's a certain condition in the womb where a fetus will have male sexual chromosomes, but will not stimulate the hormonal sort of flood of testosterone, which inaugurates what we call male pattern development. So that the result of this material process is that I'm going to say this for the sake of clarifying the argument, a human is born who has all female anatomy, like what we recognize as female. She's called daughter. She is a sister. She is a woman. She goes through puberty. There is nothing in her life that would suggest that she's somehow really a male. And often the only time people find out about this very rare intersex condition is when they get married and find that they're infertile. And then upon investigation, it turns out that they might have mostly or all male sex chromosomes throughout their body. And so you have a chromosomal, by the constitutive argument, you have a conundrum, right? Because you have a chromosomal male and an anatomical female, which means two of the principal building blocks by which you tried to get to the sum total, which is woman in this case, are at odds with each other. And this is no problem from the view that I'm trying to express, right? Which is if the mystery exceeds the parts, then change or even deficiency in the parts doesn't necessarily mean that the fact of being created woman or being created man is somehow now lost. But if you do think that what you fundamentally have is a human that has sex as a secondary characteristic of being, something that occurs to him or her, whether ontologically or temporally, then you're going to be troubled by this. You're going to be troubled by this condition because you're not going to be quite sure what to say. Do you say, okay, you're really a man, but you appear as a woman? Do you say you're really a woman, but you have male sex chromosomes? And now you're no longer, if you're philosophically consistent with that second view, you're now going to say, well, then no presence of male sexual chromosomes can now indicate beyond doubt the presence of a man or a woman. And one other thing I'd point out, so the reason I say this is similar to Butler's philosophy is that when you have the mechanical understanding, you're always building up the whole from its parts. And Butler's doing the same thing. Queer theorists are doing the same thing. It's just the parts that they're using are very different. So they're obviously using psychological parts. So for them, and I'm sure you've heard this standard line. This is what I was taught in public school, right? Is that, okay, you've got this part called your sex assignment at birth. So it's what people say about you. But then you have another part, and it's called your gender identity. So it's what you say about yourself. And then the combination of these two parts equals your stable gender. So of course, if my sex is assigned at birth as male, and then I come to develop the gender identity as male, then I'm cisgender. I'm a cisgender male is sort of how the logic works out. Now this leads to oddities, right? Like if my parents are very astute readers of Butler, and they assign me at birth as a gender belonging to no gender, and I subsequently develop the identity of a gender, then technically speaking, I'm a cisgender person again, because all that requires to be cisgender is for your sex assignment to match with your gender identity, which is obviously paradoxical. Right. But my point is that both of these, you might call it the psychological building blocks and the biological building blocks, they're both prescinding from the question of creation. They're both prescinding from how were we made? Who are we? And are instead trying to say what produces the stable appearance. For Butler, what produces the stable appearance is a whole lot more than the biological building blocks. But you have to understand when you're reading Butler, she's not saying that the biological building blocks do not contribute, that they're not a part of the process. They're actually in agreement over there. It's just that with the conservatives, it's just that for the postmoderns, biology is always a interpreted biology.
Hmm.
Whereas for the conservatives who are advocating for this mechanical model, the biological facts bear no interpretation. They have like some kind of direct access to reality.
Gotcha. So it sounds like the conservatives are starting from material parts in a
Right.
reductionistic way. The postmodern queer theorists are starting with psychological parts,
Yeah.
also in a reductionistic way. And it sounds like, and we'll get into this, that the Catholic is saying, no, we got to start with the whole, and that whole needs to be the building, the ground upon which we build when it comes to our understanding of
Right.
creation and
And
gender.
we know this, I think, in both. You're totally right, Dom. You're totally right. And I think we actually know this within both traditions. It's just that there's a lot of obscurity to it.
Mm.
So what I mean is, if you look at both the biologist and the psychologist claims, let's call them that for a sec. It's funny because both of them do not have access to the mystery itself. So if I want to know whether you're a man, I could wait for a blood test
Mm-hmm.
on the biologist side, or I could wait for a pronoun on the psychologist side, right? I could
Mhm.
wait for you to reveal your genitals on the biologist side, and please don't, right? Or I could wait for you to reveal your self-identification on the
Mhm.
psychologist side, or your place within the equation of sex assignment, gender identity equaling a stable gender. In both cases, it's kind of a creepy position because
Right.
we're waiting for a revelation that may or may not
Yeah.
come. Granted, it's probably less creepy to wait around for a pronoun, than it is for a blood test. But it's still certainly a removal from reality, and it's interesting because it's sort of an unchecked presumption of the more conservative side, or the biological side, I should say, that that somehow they are free of this position. I've just noticed this paradox. Well, they'll say, if you're a man, sexual chromosomes are like this. You're a woman if you have a vagina. And it's like, well, then you don't know if most people are men or women. Like,
Yeah.
that follows. You have a guess on the basis of secondary attributes, I presume. But
Mhm.
okay, so I think in both cases there's a certain removal from reality, and that the right, in reacting to the left, actually ends up imitating the left. And so what you get in both cases is a lack of standing before the mystery that's created, the whole that you mentioned, and a really furious kind of investigation of parts, which is understandable given the time. I'm not like, why are people doing this? This is crazy. Actually, no, it's precisely what you have to do within American culture in order to appear to have science and truth on your side. So both sides are working the angle there. It's just that I don't think Catholics should.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And before we move on to Ivan Illich, it seems to me that we say that we should approach this from the whole, from the mystery, and I think that the conservatives and the postmoderns do the same thing. They have their own whole, but it's like an anti-whole, which is the whole that presupposes we start from parts. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's always a hidden ontology going on, right? You can't quite just prescind from these questions, because you're right. You are presuming that the human person is the kind of thing that is understood as a collection of parts, but that's obviously not a collection of parts. That's a whole that, that's under discussion.
Yeah.
And one of the ways you see this is in I mentioned it briefly, but in the kind of ascent of the idea of a human anthropoid as preceding any sex or even gender. Like for both, and this is an ontological distinction. I'm not saying that the conservatives think that there's some like temporal moment at which the fetus is not male or female, right? Because I think they think it's concomitant with existence at the same time as existence, that it's a male fetus or a female fetus. But ontologically, it seems like what they're arguing is that you have a fundamental reality called the human, and the human is neither male nor female as such. And then the modification of the human by the parts is what gets you the sexed human, the male human or the female human. So precisely, this is precisely the same as the Butlerian position. They're both assuming a reality, which I refer to as androgyny, but which you could also think of as just like the neuter human, as being the kind of ontological fundament which sex is a modification. And then they're squabbling over what modifies the human. Is it anatomy, or is it psychology? Is it chromosomes, or is it social constructs? And if you're Butler, I think you say that it's all of the above. And if you are anti-Butler, then you say that it is just the biological realities.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is basically that there's no escape from having an anthropology, from having a cosmology, and inevitably a theology, even if it's a kind of a theology. And I think that's really the point: is that we live the secular liberal paradigm way of looking at the world is not neutral. It has its own anthropology and cosmology, and I think people are being lied to and buying into the lie that they can have their own anthropology and cosmology and theology. If you buy into people can have their own private ones, you've already bought into a different one without knowing it.
Yeah,
You see what I'm saying?
Well, it's funny because it's exactly what we do. No, I mean, Dom, you're totally right. I mean, there is a description of the human person that's been philosophically developed for hundreds of years, probably about 400 years to really point it out, 500 if you want me to blame the Protestants explicitly, but an anthropology that thinks of the human being as individual, thinks of the human being as mechanical, material, thinks of the human being as androgynous in the way I just described, and ultimately thinks of the human being as something not very mysterious. I would say the simplest way to put it is thinks of the human being as another one of the animals. It doesn't have any transcendence. Yeah. But that idea of wanting to have different, like we get to sort of pick and choose between ontological descriptions rather than having to commit to one, is really funny because it's precisely what we do, right? What I mean is, like, you take like a good, nice liberal, like someone that's just trying to get along, not get sued, the goals of modernity, right? And they live on a street, and the house next to them, the couple has a baby girl, and they come over, they make a cake, they say, congratulations, you had a girl, how wonderful, and they talk about girls. And there's no presumption whatsoever of social construct. There's no presumption of anything besides that sex assignment is in fact a recognition of a reality. And then their neighbor next door the next weekend has a party for their teenage son, who now identifies as their teenage daughter. And so you go to that party and you say, oh, congratulations, you're so brave. Of course, gender is a social construct, and you have understood your true identity, and we're here for you, and we're going to support you. And it feels insane because what you're really doing is trying to have two different ontologies, two different anthropologies, and to apply them differently for different people. On the one hand, it's a biological fact. On the other hand, it's a social construct. On the one hand, parental authority is a sort of source of wisdom. On the other hand, parental authority is sort of a placeholder for an eventual individual choice of who you are. And by switching back and forth between them, what you really reveal is that you don't care about either.
Right.
What you really reveal is that you're a nihilist. What you really reveal is that you will do anything to avoid conflict.
Yeah.
What's the fundamental presumption at both? Well, the fundamental presumption at both is that the situation, as it were, determines the gender, determines man and woman. So you assess a situation and you say, well, this is a very biological seeming situation, and that's going to make a baby girl. And this is a very social seeming situation, and that's going to make a trans woman. And I think that's just, I mean, it's not only nihilism, it's actually a bit frightening, because what it usually means to have a different ontological status for certain human beings is that certain human beings aren't human, and like essentially slaves or essentially subhuman. So it's actually more of a return, I think, to this kind of liberal nihilism is actually more of a turn to the attitudes that you would see like in ancient Greece, where there are these sort of heavy ontological distinctions between like the Greeks and the barbarians, for instance, slave and free, and between male and female, actually, is that you now have a the kind of, you have a different set of rules, as it were, that governs different kinds of people. There's no more unity.
Yeah, no, when you move away from the wholeness of the whole, and reduce things to the parts,
Yeah.
then the whole breaks apart. And I think you're right to point to the beginning of the movement, sort of the Protestant Reformation, and the disintegration of the what David Schindler calls the form, right, the real symbol, which is what the Catholic Church is. So it's inevitable that everything would disintegrate and lose its kind of ultimate meaning, and it becomes nihilistic. But with that depressing statement, let's maybe move on to Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
Who is this man, and why is he important in this topic?
Oh man, Um, Ivan Illich is a genius. Was a genius. He's passed away. God rest his soul. He is not without. He's fraught with certain dangers. I mean, this is a man who opposed Humanae Vitae as a priest. He was a priest. Who sort of quasi left the priesthood. I mean, he didn't make a big shebang of it the way that so many people did, where it's like, it's Vatican II and I'm marrying a nun now. See ya. It's much more sort of distant than that. He was proficient in like 7 or 8 languages. He founded language centers all in up and down North and South America. He was known for a paradoxical set of claims, all which could boil down to the idea that modernity is counterproductive. So he says things like modern travel makes you slow, modern healthcare makes you sick.
Mm.
And in each sort of set of paradoxes, what he's very enlightening in being able to reveal how what we think of as sort of normal or common sense, what's the word? Structures of modernity are in fact very actively put there.
They're doing the opposite of it.
He's I don't know if I'd call him a communist, but
Mm.
he seems like it a lot of the times. So with regards to gender, though, I'm sure is where we're
Right. Well, it sounds like you're saying he was saying that modernity is promising certain things, but doing the opposite, even though it's lying to us and claiming it's actually producing what it's claiming it's going to produce. But before we move on into the gender, what he has to say about gender, because I was listening through yours and Maria's a series on gender,
Yeah.
and you read him critically. You disagree with a lot of things that he said. For example, there was a section on confession. He blamed the practice of confession as a destructive of gender, and you disagreed there. So we're not endorsing this guy, because I'm keeping in mind some of my audience here. We're not blank stately endorsing, but he had some very, very, as you pointed out, interesting things to say. So what are those things specifically about gender?
Yeah, so he comes at it from, he's writing in the 60s, I think. Actually, no, this was in the 80s, I think, where he's looking at feminism of his day. And the feminism of his day is basically striving towards equality between man and woman. And what he is trying to argue is that there is no nation organized for consumption the way that modern capitalist nations are that is not fundamentally sexist. So that you don't get to simply, within the structures of our contemporary society, produce gender equality, because the very nature of the woman actually is such that any equality actually kind of comes at her expense. So let me back this up. I mean, I think we can all see in some ways that there's a sleight of hand going on within liberal society's offering of gender equality. Because when you hear it, it sounds like men and women should be equal. But then when you investigate the different methods and modes that those two folks have to undergo to become equal, it starts to seem a little unequal. So for instance, when I sit there and thinking, hey, I'm a male and I would love to be equal with women, what do? Well, I don't do anything, actually. I just go out and I live my life. It's great.
Yeah.
Everyone loves me. What does a woman do? Well, a woman has to undergo surgery to be equal, whether sterilization or just the constant suppression of menstruation. A woman has to have the availability of abortion. Potentially, at least, the murder of her child is necessary for the attainment of gender equality. And even if we look a little more, if we could take a little distance, it's obviously the case that the very structure of pregnancy and child rearing falls on the woman in such a way that the only equality that's achieved is either by finding spaces in which those women do not have to in fact undergo pregnancy and childbirth, which, unless you want the loss of humanity as such, inevitably just means paying a other social class, usually from a different country, to do things like childcare. I guess we're seeing even more of this with like surrogacy and such, but it just seems obvious to Illich that there's a sort of fundamental difference between man and woman, which means that whenever equality is the aim, women always lose. So it's always a kind of equality achieved by the negation of what it means to be a woman, so that you both exist within an equal dignity of the quasi-male. You know, the male form becomes predominant, and this seems obvious to me, right? Like, women never argue in our country for a kind of similarity of men to themselves. They always argue for a similarity of women to men. And in this sense, they fulfill what was feminism used to sort of point out with a critical eye, was the sexism of ancient Greece, where the woman was considered as a deficient male ontologically. Like, what is a woman? Well, nature strives for the production of a male, but due to certain influences, sometimes it doesn't reach that natural end of the production of the male, and so you end up with a female, which is necessary according to nature, that is to say, according to the need for reproduction. Ironically, we're kind of there again socially, which is that, you know, the perfect thing is to be a male, namely to not suffer consequences of pregnancy and child rearing and menstruation and everything else. So if we can get equality, it's going to be by making women like the male, not the male like the women, which I actually think would be great for Catholics to do, is to advocate for gender equality, but just the other way around. Like, why don't we just make men have to experience pain and bleeding every month as like, why not get extremely feminist with this? It's like,
yeah. No, I mean, in what you're saying is the irony, right? Which is that liberalism is in fact sexist, and it is so in the name of gender equality.
Yeah.
And it's really the Catholic Church that is, crying out for the dignity of women. And
Illich says, he doesn't refer to it as the Catholic Church, but his all his references are to Christendom, to medieval culture, and what he's seeing again and again is a totally different way of approaching it. There was no drive for equality because the presumption was difference. So then the drive was to create distinct worlds that were related to each other asymmetrically and with complementarity, obviously, because, no matter what, men and women got to dance together for humanity to persist.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the past, what you find is that women and men actually had spheres of authority and culture and custom and tradition that were proper to them as women and men. And that the actual loss that liberalism occasions in the life of both the female and the male is what Illich calls a gendered world, or a gendered domain, where it really is we talk about them as female spaces, but this is sort of like a breathing room from our otherwise androgynous reality. But for them, there was no third reality that transcended the mutual reality of the male and female worlds. That had to be invented. So it gives lots of examples, like within agricultural work, there were, and he's speaking broadly of medieval Europe, but it applies pretty much wherever you don't have modern capitalism and industrialism. So let the whatever conclusions you draw from that, you go ahead. But you have a complex structure of taboos that both men and women face about what tools they can use, how they can use them, how to dress. These worlds are governed by honor and shame, so that any transgression of the sort of norms of male behavior, the norms of female behavior, are internally governed by the groups themselves, as opposed to judged by some sort of outside legal structure or something like that. And you have the basic idea that part of what it means to be known in a community, to belong to a particular people, is to be able to seamlessly live within their gender domain. He at some point says, like, a stranger is someone that, a stranger is someone who doesn't know what makes our kind of woman. Things like this. So part of to give this brief, I'm not trying to take too much time on this, but it's an important idea because we often look at our gender confusion today and we don't recognize that there is an economic reality that frames how we see men and women. I mean, the idea that you could simply go to a pre-industrialist, pre-capitalist society and start spouting off ideas of like the primary human who becomes sexed in different ways. One of the reasons it seems a little ridiculous is because the world of men and the world of women was so uniquely independent, and that their structures of authority and their lives had a kind of consistency as a gender, which we simply do not have today. Like, the only place that I can conceive of it still existing is in bathrooms and man caves. These seem to be the two horrible gender domains left. And of course, they annex to the male, not the female. There's not a woman cave, for instance. So part of Illich's critique is that these worlds were destroyed precisely for the sake of industrial style living, industrial style working, and industrial style production. So what I mean is that in order to make a factory work well, you kind of have to have men and women doing the same thing, as opposed to living in these very distinct domains. Something about gender itself resisted the idea of people being treated homogeneously, which just makes sense, right? Because if the world is irreducibly twofold, if every time you want to talk about the human being, you're forced to talk about which kind,
right?
There's something irreducibly different about your social order, which means that it has a sort of immunity, as it were, to being brought into a homogenous state of production, a homogenous sort of governance. It's like, and he points out to the ways in which when early capitalism was taking off, it occasioned a lot of, he calls it this sort of unspoken tragedy of these worlds collapsing, where he points to a lot of divorces and a lot of complete lack of comprehension on the part of men and women, as their lives were totally changed by the fact that now they had to touch all the same tools. Now they all retired to the same houses. Now their work was all done in the same place. Now there were no distinct objects or places that indicated female authority as opposed to male authority. And of course, this is maybe most obvious in the way that the female authority over birth quickly became a male-centered reality, posing as a kind of non-male, objective, scientific reality, which is the loss of the midwife, the loss of the home birth, the beginning of a sort of, the business of being born, as the documentary puts it. So that's what Illich is describing with gender. He's saying you can't just get everything to be fine and dandy within liberal capitalist nation states when it comes to man and woman, because they are constructed on the basis of the destruction of distinct male and female worlds for the sake of cleaner, more efficient production. And one of the ways I think people are already aware of this is to look at like America's experience with World War II, when we basically had something left of a subsistence economy, had something left of a gendered world, a gendered domain, and then moved women into the workforce, as it was said, and then never got them out again. And this is usually taken as a sort of a gain for liberation, which obviously it is if the point is to attain a kind of male equality. Then that's liberation. But if, when considered in terms of what happened to the female world, you're talking about an absolute irreparable loss.
Not just oppression, but destruction. Yeah.
But that destruction was obviously very profitable, because all this, you have utilized, you basically doubled your workforce, right? You've utilized a current what's the word? Previously underutilized resource. Now, obviously, now we have to confront the reality that faces us. Like, we live in this age. So there's obviously real equality that is achieved precisely in things like fair pay, right? So I'm not doing a big return argument here.
Right. Well,
Reality.
yeah. No, I mean, speaking of which, I mean, so because let's see for the audience if I can recap some of what you're saying here. Basically, this what, if I'm not mistaken, Illich calls the Homo economicus,
Yeah.
becomes this kind of androgynous individual, and the value of an individual in a society of personal contracts, I think it would be. That's the barometer for equality and equal dignity.
Man,
And what happens? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's very, very clear. You should have said that instead of letting me.
No, you're good. You're good. No, so because I mean I've been thinking about this and recently this destruction of gendered worlds is predicated on a cosmology of scarcity and profit.
Yes.
And that leads me to a question that I was going to ask you later, but I think it's better if I ask you now. Is the solution to recover these gender worlds to return to 1950s gender roles? Or is it maybe a lot more fundamental than that?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
No, yeah, definitely not the 1950s. I mean, there's a lot of good there, of course. There's always good.
Yeah.
You got to remember, when we talk about liberalism and worldviews, these ideologies, like, they're always parasitic on the human experience, which is fundamentally good. And so sometimes when people listen to these conversations, they can think like, oh, like, gender's been irredeemably lost because we're all a bunch of satanic money grubbers. And it's like, that's true, but only to an extent. The truth is, we're all human and we all want the good, and we all talk to each other and we all make friends with each other, and we develop gendered worlds within our families, and then sort of by default. The point is that we need the ideological structures of modernity that oppress us, need us to remain good enough in our humanity to have something to oppress. And that's what's really happening. It's not like the obliteration of gender out of existence. It's the continued production of just enough gender difference in order to
have something to oppress.
Yeah. So in some ways it's more wicked, but it's also more hopeful, because the tyrant always needs something that's not tyrannical over which to be a tyrant.
Right.
That's sort of that's my like political philosophy caveat for optimism. But
gotcha.
Yeah, I don't think the 50s is the answer, because the 50s is really where you see what you might just call the conservative construction of gender working for a time. So what I mean is, by the 50s era, you did have the loss of gendered worlds. You had the largely there's no more Catholic vision of distinct difference with distinct authority. But it feels very conservative. Why? Well, because the kinds of things that successfully produced man and woman are kinds of things that Catholics generally like. So Schindler talks about this a lot, where he looks around at modernity and he says, the problem is that you can do the same kinds of things for very different reasons. And the 50s was a time, 40s and 50s was a time where a lot of people were doing the same things as Christendom, but for very different reasons. I mean, one of the things that I always like to point to is, sometimes this might seem a little off topic, but sometimes people talk about the loss of mass attendance. People go to mass as if it were this kind of unique Catholic phenomenon, sort of maybe a product of the Vatican Council or something, Second Vatican Council or something like that. But anyone who's looked at the numbers sees that at the exact same time that mass participation is falling out, you have participation in every other kind of social or fraternal organization falling out. So it's falling out from the Masons, falling out from the philanthropic clubs, falling out from the sports leagues, falling out from, I mean, you name it, in America, we were losing it. So when you look at that data, what suggests itself is that prior to the fallout, people were going to mass for a very different reason than they were going to mass in, say, medieval Norway. Why? Because in order to fall out at the same degree as other social clubs, you kind of have to be living as if the mass and as if the faith is a social club. And when you look at the history prior to it, you see that is the case, that Christianity during the wars had been expressed as a kind of national reality, a way in which we were Americans, a way in which we weren't communists, a way in which we showed the goodness of our way of life, etc., etc. So that when, as the Cold War dies down, as it becomes less relevant, then Christianity, which has been reconfigured as opposition to communism and atheism and everything bad, now it falls away,
Exactly. Yeah.
So just to talk about 1950s gender, it's something that's my analogy. And I do this to people where I'm like, I'm going to make an analogy, and then I use something that's new information, like at least debatable. And so this simplifies it. Maybe it complicates it. But with gender, you can see how in the kind of stereotype of the housewife, you have something a lot more like the anxiety of the trans person today, which is namely that this being of man and woman no longer has the enforcement and the depth of a gendered world behind it, right? Because there's no agricultural community, there's no well that women are getting water from, there's no center of authority where the woman actually speaks authoritatively about children, about childbirth, about certain works, and there's no cottage industry or a home economy in which the home is considered as a kind of dance of male and female worlds that keeps the family in being. That's all out the window. So now you have the meaning of man and woman no longer has this cultural liturgy with which to learn it. So now we have to learn it extrinsically, right? And when we, especially in America, but just generally, when we have to now learn a reality extrinsically, we tend to turn towards commodities to provide it for us. Okay, so what makes a woman a woman? Well, a woman becomes like the person that the advertisements say she is, right? So you've all seen these kind of old sexist advertisements, and we've all laughed at them. Like, how could people be so dumb as to think that, a real woman uses this kind of blender, or, you know what I mean? Like these sort of, which is hilarious, of course, because currently we exist in a world in which commodity production isn't simply suggested as the way in which to determine yourself as a man or woman. It isn't required. Like, you got to buy the hormones.
Yeah.
You've got to perform facts. It's on the market now. I mean, you can describe the trans moment as a revolution if you want, but it sure seems a lot more like just another thing becoming a commodity. And precisely in the same way that manhood and womanhood was becoming a commodity in the 50s and 60s. So, to be a man, you have to wear this, you have to speak to your wife like that. I mean, this was the age where it was very popular for people to read instructionals on how to behave like a woman or how to behave like a man, where they, this kind of like, real men do this, real women do that. And we can look back on that in the past and say, oh, well, wasn't it awesome? Didn't they have like a moral code to being a man and woman? Didn't they have like this kind of like ethical standards? But I think we would be mistaking the true sources of standard and norms and honor and shame. Like, if it's coming from a handbook and an advertisement, the world has already been lost.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, I'm exaggerating to make the point. The point is not that all women in the 50s were just completely devoid of such character that they had to buy, turkey basters or whatever to make it work. But the point is, you can see that once gender has been stripped of receiving itself from the customary cultural life of a people, that the turn to commodity production as a new source of affirming that one is a man, is a woman, that becomes possible for the first time. And so, of course, where it's possible, we see it in part.
Yeah, and also maybe you could say it's precisely because gender is a fundamental reality that we can even speak of this tyranny, and why this tyranny can only exist if gender is a reality right now, here and now. So it is here with us. It's just being oppressed, really.
Yeah, I think there's something fundamental about the way that we are given to ourselves in creation, right? Like, I didn't sign a contract to come into being. I was given I was given to myself. And I would actually argue that my sex is given to me prior, like to the order of knowledge, prior to me even being given to myself as like a fully conscious human being. I mean, what I'm saying something very simple. I think you're a boy before you really know what it means to be Mark, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain sort of introductory phase to the uniqueness of the human person that sex seems to provide. But this being a man or a woman naturally comes with a sense of a task or a vocation. Like if you look at our bodies, they obviously cry out that there's something that you're supposed to do here.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's answered just by the sheer fact of sort of complementarity of the bodies
Right.
female. I think that the very first experience of the body is always as this problem, this vocation, this something is to be done with me, and I need to figure out what it is. So sometimes it's easy to think of gender as being like invented so recently that all of these questions, am I a man, am I a woman, are somehow unnatural. But I don't think that's quite the case. I think the reasoning about it under the conditions of scarcity is unnatural, right? Where you say, I am deficient in attaining to manhood or womanhood, therefore I need hormonal productions, I need advertisements telling me what to do. That's unnatural. It's very odd that we have been stripped of any source of our being a man or a woman outside of what money can buy. That's unnatural. But it's not unnatural to encounter the fact of being radically different precisely in a shared humanity that sets like our wonder on fire and has go look for how to become what we are. And in some ways you can see this just throughout the Christian tradition, is that the desire to be a man was often the foundation by which Christian preaching helped pagan cultures then desire to be a Christian, because they're already working within these differentiated worlds to successfully, honorably be a man, to successfully, honorably be a woman. And so then the work of the Christian, which paradoxically says things like neither male nor female in Christ Jesus, is take this reality and then say, here's how to fulfill this desire in your heart. Here's how, I mean, they didn't say it like this, obviously, but here's how the ethics of honor and shame are transcended in the good, or something like that. That's really what, I mean, that's the history of Christian evangelization in a lot of ways.
Yeah. No, it sounds like in a certain sense, gender is a mission, or to put it differently, a person is a gift. He's meant to go out of himself. He has a task, and that's only possible if there's the other, capital O, so a gendered world where there's a dance possible, a kind of mutual giving of self. But and that, I think this is a good way to lead into the scriptural basis for what we're talking about, because we've talked about Butler, we've talked about Illich, we've talked about the modern liberal world and how it destroys gendered worlds. So how does the Old Testament speak of gender? What's our foundation for, because we've given a critique, what's now, how do we build our gendered worlds conceptually on the given of Revelation?
Genesis is remarkable, and it rather makes me think that the fullness of what it means to be man or a woman is in fact an article of faith, or it's something that is not simply available to natural reason, which
interesting,
is a debatable point for many reasons. What I don't mean is that the proposition there are men and there are women is somehow something only attainable through the reading of the scriptures. However, when you look at the history of responses to this sort of data of there being women, the conclusions are not all the same as to what it means that we're men and women. And so to answer your question, when we look at Genesis, I think people can miss the radical nature of the claim, male and female, he created them. Part of this is because they don't understand the context of Genesis, which is polemical. It is an argument. The Genesis text, however you locate its authorship, which I don't care at this point.
But
same. Very clear about the text of Genesis. is that is written in opposition to the myths that were surrounding the Israelite people. These rival claims about who man is, who God is, and what the relationship between the two amounts to.
Mm-hmm.
And so from the very first, you see these strange things within the Genesis account that insult the gods and stories of the peoples that preceded this Israelite theology that's expressed in Genesis. So, for instance, you see God making the sun and the moon, which of course were gods worshipped by the Hittites. You see him making the earth and the sky and separating them out, which of course are also gods. Almost by every primeval culture we can find, there's an earth and sky god somewhere at the bottom of it.
Mm-hmm.
Makes the animals, which were worshipped by the Egyptians, which the Israelites had a lot of fun making fun of that fact. But so you see in the very account of creation as proceeding from God the Father, you also have the demythologization of the various creatures that he creates. It's like Genesis is just again and again saying, oh, this thing you thought was a god, in fact, is a creature. But the number one cause of idolatry, of course, is man, both as the object of idolatry and the cause.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sincere fear within Israelite history. If you've read the Old Testament, they are very apt to, as the Book of Wisdom says, worship as a god what they had previously considered to be a man. And it makes sense because man is the image of God. And so there's a certain natural proclivity to make an idol of the image of
Mm-hmm.
if we understand idolatry to be a bad attempt at worshiping God. Okay, so in the Genesis text, man is also created, but alone among all the creations, man is created male and female. Now, the other animals were created according to their kind, but this means something different. And even by the time you get to Aquinas, he's going to say, well, what it means to be created according to kind is that they were created out of what he calls a common determinate matter. So the male and female birds are created out of the common air. The male and female beasts are created out of the common earth. The male and female fish are created out of the common water. But something different happens with man. He's created male and female, but then in the second account of the creation in Genesis, it's described that he's created male and female in two distinct acts of divine power. So the man is created from the earth, and the woman is created from the rib of man.
Mm-hmm.
This, again, is a polemic against the myths, because when you turn to the myths, what you find is the ancients looked at man and woman and asked themselves the question, what does it mean and where do they come from? And came to the answer that man is fundamentally androgynous, and that his division into the sexes is a secondary characteristic of his being. And almost always, this secondariness was negative. It was a fall. So man falls into sex. He falls into being male and female. But don't just take it from me. I'll give you a few examples, because you might as well. You got time for that, Dom?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the one people are most familiar with, I think, is Pandora, right? So in the beginning, according to Hesiod, in the golden age of man, man lives with the gods, and he's having a great time, immortal. And there's not really a distinction between him and the gods. But what's clear is that he's all male.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is really interesting, right? Because what is an all-male world? Well,
Right.
it's the same as a sexless world.
Yeah.
That's why I'm very comfortable using the term androgyny to describe these myths, because male is only male on the basis of its standing vis-a-vis the female, and the female is only female and it's standing vis-a-vis the male. And so if you were ever to take man alone, you've never somehow retained him in his sexual difference. Like, I'm going to take this sexually differentiated person and then just make a world of only him. You've in fact done away with difference entirely. He's not male anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a note. So when the Greeks are talking about this all-male world, they're talking about an androgynous, that is to say, sexless reality. And then, as is wont to happen, the human beings squabble with the gods over who gets which part of the sacrificial meal. The humans through Prometheus, the humans trick the gods into receiving the worst part, and the gods punish them by doing what? Just doing the worst thing they can think of, making a woman. They, they work hard at it. They manufacture her. All the gods sort of pitch in, and it's obviously distinct from creation. It's sort of like an artificial. It's funny because Pandora, it really is created in a way that we tend to now describe man and woman as being created, as being built up of parts. Only it's very like shipbuilding almost when it comes to Pandora,
Right.
to our sort of psychological, biological parts. Okay, so they build her. They send her to man. Man welcomes her into his home. Big mistake. She inaugurates the age of death by virtue of inaugurating the age of reproduction, because these are just two sides of the same coin. The reason we reproduce is because we're threatened with death, and so the man as a reproducing being has to be a dying being. But the point to take away is woman is a curse for man here. Man falls into difference. You can see this in, it's just everywhere. Obviously, Aristophanes' myth and the Symposium people are familiar with. These adorable round androgynes who have male and female parts, sometimes male and male, female, female. But sexual difference as such doesn't exist because it's all within androgyny. And these androgynes threaten Olympus because they're so strong and so powerful and so perfect in their plenitude that they're going to overpower Zeus and the gods. And so Zeus cuts them in half and sends them on their different ways. And again, the important thing to notice is that in describing the beginning of human existence, sex is considered a way of weakening man. So man in his plenitude escapes it. Man in his scarcity and need suffers it. Once again, the presence of the woman, distinct woman, is a curse. There's in the myth Atrahasis, which has a lot of different versions.
Yeah,
basically one of the oldest creation stories. You often hear it comparing flood accounts. There's a problem in that man who's not described very clearly, but basically he is annoying the gods with his noise. There's many men, and so the gods are annoyed. They don't know what to do, and so the way they destroy man is through this catastrophic flood. But then when they recreate him, they do so by changing, or at least introducing, woman as a limiting principle, again, of man's ability to compete or to threaten divine status. So now it says, well, now there's going to be women who miscarry. There's going to be women who never bear children. And this is going to be how man is kept within bounds. Okay, I could give a lot more examples. They'll probably come up. But suffice to say, it's very hard to find a myth that doesn't presume this sort of primal androgyny, from Zoroastrianism to the Athenian founding myth to,
Enuma Elish too, and they're making noise, and same thing. Heavens are split in half, and Marduk rises up. But yeah, no, I find this very interesting because you mentioned that there's this primal androgyny, that the woman is a curse. It sounds like, if people have been listening since the beginning of this episode, that we've made it full circle.
Oh yeah.
And which is really the critique I think that you are offering. And I think basically that in today's world, the Homo economicus is the primal androgynous individual, and I think you're going to get more into how because he's not divisible, there's a sense in which he is divine. He has a kind of simplicity to him, which means he's self-sufficient. Right. And so there really is a kind of ego worship that's interesting to me, and it's tied into money, interestingly enough. But but then Genesis speaks of women not as a curse, and of there being man and male and female as a blessing, and of women being as a helpmate. So could you talk about that?
And I hope people will forgive the setup here, because the point is, Genesis says something different.
Yes.
it is surrounded by a common conclusion that man is an androgen who falls into sex, and it says that man is created male and female. So it makes the order of creation. And you have to remember, the order of creation is the creation that God calls very good, which means that the Jewish person is the one who's forever forbidden from saying that something in the original creation is bad. So the male and femaleness is a blessing. It is part of the created order. And then I would argue that it's only in the fallen order that you have an attempt at androgyny, so precisely the opposite of the myths. But to stick a little with the first part of that, God creates man, and he says something really fascinating, which is that it is not good for man to be alone. And the reason I'm fascinated by this is it sounds kind of heretical, but since God's saying it, I know it can't be. But think about it. If it's the creation and it's very good, and God, who is perfectly good, cannot create something bad, for him to say something is not good in creation at least leads to a theological pause. It's like, well, surely you don't mean that is not good as in evil for man to be alone, because then God is the creator of evil, and then we've got all sorts of problems.
Mannequin problems, yeah.
But the way that this has been understood in the tradition, of course, is that when God says it is not good for man to be alone, he's saying something to the equivalent of it is not possible for man to be alone. Because what is good and what is possible in the original creation we're saying the same thing. And so what we see in the second Genesis account is a certain as if. Namely, what if man was as the myths described him? You remember the polemical context. It's drawing back and saying, okay, let's talk about Adam alone. Right? Now, we've already said he's created male and female. So that's not under any question. But what if man was created alone? Or let's look at him alone. And we've heard, I think, a sort of common interpretation of this that involves man finding the kind of symmetry necessary for reproduction in the woman, which he didn't have with all the other animals. And there's a lot that I don't like about it, even though I think it can be redeemed, in that if it's not good for man to be alone in the same way that it would not be good for the male cat to be alone, it's not that there isn't a truth there, it's just that it's not that interesting to me. And it seems like the Bible is doing something so profound. There's never been a part of the Bible where I'm more like, I'm going to read this my entire life and still only be scraping the surface. So it's not good for man to be alone. Well, there's another interpretation, and I'm using the Jewish tradition here, the Jewish Midrash tradition. I'm most familiar with it from the commentaries of Rashi, who's a medieval rabbi. But he is, of course, citing a far older tradition. So it seems like a very old. So it has the kind of weight of antiquity to it. But he says the reason God said it's not good for man to be alone is because when God created man, all the animals and the angels looked at him and said, well, there is no procreation in his life, and there's no procreation in the life of God. Therefore, man is God. Adam is alone in his world, and God is alone in his world. As Aquinas will later say, he's perfect in himself. Therefore, man is God. And it's for this reason that God says it is not good for man to be alone. Namely, it is the risk of idolatry present in the lack of sexual difference that is not good. Right? So this explains then the kind of odd presence of privation, where it's a looking forward to a future sin.
Mark, can I just interject real quick?
Yeah,
I'm reminded of the passage with the sons of God and the Nephilim. It sounds like they're demythologizing other quote-unquote heroes of the surrounding nations by making them basically have sex with humans to kind of make them less divine. I don't know if that's I just thought about that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think the kind of divinity that the sons of God have is the same kind of divinity that the Bible critiques of Pharaoh, the god kings of antiquity. So I think you're quite right that they are referring to the production of the appearance of divinity, and let's be clear, you can only produce the appearance of divinity if you get over sexual difference. And this is your point, right? That if they have sex, then they're not divine.
Right.
But this was a common argument of the early Christians against the Roman gods. One of the things I'm thinking of Lactantius, one of the things he would constantly argue is that you think your gods are real, but there's women, there's female gods. If there's female gods, then he makes a bunch of arguments, but one of them is that, well, if the gods don't need to reproduce, then they're useless. And if they do reproduce, then they're not God, because that means that they die and that they're insufficient. But most importantly comes this argument that if there are male and female gods, then those gods are not perfect, because in respect to femaleness, the male god lacks. And in respect to maleness, the female god lacks. So what you really have is the creation of imperfect beings. Therefore, your gods are really men who you forgot were men.
Right.
And I think that's something very profound there, although he didn't really intend it quite in the way I'm taking it. But think of how profound it is to say that the fact of the sexually different other reveals to us that we are not God. Because when I look on the face of the other who is sexually different, then I become differentiated. Like, I become aware that I am only male vis-a-vis a female who I am not. But that means that I am by nature, by the very creation as male and female, I am self-insufficient. I cannot aspire to the sufficiency of God, who is sufficient in himself. Right? So,
which is why he's simple as well. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so there's no sex in God. We've heard that said, and it makes sense. But what I think we need to realize is the presence of sex is a prophylactic against idolatry in man. Now, this is a negative description. I don't think it's just that, right? But I think that tradition really helps clarify what Genesis is saying. Because remember, all those myths of androgyny were also myths of divinity. We used to be gods, and then we fell, which means that the fundamentally what's expressed is enmity between man and God, between the human condition and the divinity he lacks. But Genesis is going to go on to describe the fall as the production of envy with divinity. That is to say, it is through sin and not through creation that we are somehow less than a god. What does woman do for man? Woman helps him rejoice in the fact that he is not God. So the primal vocation of the woman is as a help. This is how it's described in Genesis. I will create a helpmate for him. But every other time in the Bible that word help is used in the Hebrew, it always indicates the kind of help that God gives to Israel. That is to say, salvation from your enemies. And it seems to me that it's more proper to speak of woman having a primal vocation to help the man in this sense, namely that she, in her very objective being, is always a sacrament of man's creatureliness. She always both represents and affects the fact that man is not God. But it's more than that. It's actually, I think, more profound than that, because there's lots of things, I suppose, that could remind man that he is not God. So the same rabbis that talked about the woman as indicating his non-divinity also talked about Adam's sleep. You know, before God pulls the rib out of Adam, he mercifully gives him a little anesthetic. They also refer to that as, well, that's evidence that you're not God too. So again, the Jews, man, when they write, their number one concern is
idolatry. Yeah.
So they interpret that the same way. Okay, why is Adam sleeping? Because God doesn't sleep. And I think that's very significant. And it's the same. We're really saying the same thing. But what does the woman do that sleep doesn't? Well, obviously, there's the whole procreative reality that I'm not talking about yet, right? Which is when woman embodies, as it were, man's creatureliness, she does it in a way that he loves. Now, this is crucially important because the whole text of Genesis is trying to get us to love that which the pagans do not love, which is our non-divinity. So how does non-divinity come to the man? How does non-divinity present itself to the would-be androgen, really just the human heart with all its proclivities towards idolatry, towards breaking what he perceives as the limits of his nature? Well, that sign of his creatureliness comes as a woman who's lovely. I mean, she's beautiful. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes very movingly about this in his commentaries on Genesis, where he says, in Eve, Adam's limit has stepped into the world. And it's not that he sees this as a curse. Remember, when Pandora steps into the world, she signifies to man his limit. Namely, you shall reproduce through me, and you shall die as a reproducing animal, as opposed to this golden age you once had before the woman. So she also approaches man as his limit. But the difference is that Pandora opens the box, and we hate her for all eternity, whereas Eve comes and Adam says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. Finally, he says. And according to tradition, what happens in the garden after that meeting is a marriage. So it's a free decision of each for the other to begin what we subsequently call the human race. And I just think this is like incredible for women right now, because the question of what it is to be a woman is answered here. What it is to be a woman is to be the embodiment of human limit in a form that is objectively lovable. And in the book of Sirach, there's an important verse here where it's speaking about wisdom, and wisdom is personified as she. And this woman, wisdom, has many meanings. Even so far as the Christians taking her to be an image of Mary, the mother of God, and then the church. But there's a verse that I really like, because there's just no way you can get around it meaning Eve on some level. That is the first woman. And so in some ways, woman as such. It says that wisdom was present in the beginning, when the first formed father of the world was alone, to save him from his transgression. And so right there you have this idea that to be sexually differentiated is to be involved in a beautiful liturgy whereby we celebrate our own creatureliness vis-a-vis the divine and like it. Whereas sexual difference for all the other myths involves not liking sexual difference, and ultimately not liking sex itself, because it is always a reminder that we are not divine. It's the same limit that approaches in the body of the woman. It's just that in the Judeo and then Christian tradition, it's loved. And in our current and in the pagan tradition, it's detested as a kind of imposition of limit, of form onto what ought to be divine, what ought to be boundless, what ought to be without limits. There's something very similar in the story of the Pandora, and then just like the kind of contemporary discomfort we have with being put in a box by a gender.
Right. I find this so fascinating, because it's the paradox of embracing the limit that allows theosis, really, that allows us to participate in God through the liturgy. It kind of reminds me of the Magnificat, which is the lowly become the ones raised on the thrones, right? The Queen Mother, the sons of God. Now, because now we are the sons of God. That in the Old Testament we're being demythologized, we're being elevated.
I know
everything is paradoxical.
It is. It's a full circle. I mean, you think about the divinity. I mean, this is what's so perverse about sin, is that it seeks to be God, not in the face of a God who withholds divinity from us, but from a God who is actively inviting us to marry him and so participate in his divinity. And that's what makes it so obnoxious. I mean, there's something silly about it. And this is the story of the fall. The fall is a story of attempted divinity. I mean, this isn't like a esoteric reflection on it. The whole thing says that what did Eve? Why did she eat the fruit? She ate the fruit to be like God. But God is without sex. So there's no transgression of the law of God in the garden that can't be that could be read as anything but a desire to overcome sexual difference. And I think that's actually what you see in the narrative of the fall. And I could go into that if you want, but I don't want to. That's another.
Well, let me if that's okay with you, let me just read something here from the second chapter of the Epistle to the Philippians. I think it summarizes everything you've been saying here, which is Jesus Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
Yeah.
This is the admirabile commercium that the Father spoke of.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful.
No, I get goosebumps just hearing you read that, Dom, because one thing that characterizes modernity is our inability to make a God. And anyone who is serious in considering modernity starts with that. It's not just this extrinsic, like, hey, it's kind of interesting that we don't worship people anymore, but hey. And it's precisely because Mary allowed God to become man in her that man has, we never had, but now historically has no other recourse to that divinity than through becoming like Jesus.
Exactly.
And so salvation comes from a woman in this sense, because Mary is the new Eve who perfectly fulfills the vocation that is present in Eve, which is the destruction of idolatry in man, the destruction of the possibility of idolatry in man. This is really important because we can think of, it can sound negative, but what I'm not saying is that Eve is there like sneering over at Adam, and every time he gets puffed up, it's, slapping him down one, which is, to be clear, is the order of fallen nature. Like, women preserve and are their primary vocation, which is the destruction of all gods. But the way they do it now is different than in the garden. But in the garden, it wasn't a response to an evil, obviously. It was the very reality of each one's being to the other, that nakedness without shame. And you got to think about, well, I think I'm doing the fall narrative again. So you got to tell me whether to do it or not.
Let's go ahead. I covered all the questions I wanted to ask you, so let's just go down some rabbit holes here, unless you have to go. Yeah.
No, I'm fine. In the fall, you have the inversion of the myths. So now the man and woman who are very good by the order of creation are going to become the primal androgen, are going to try to do so. It's not super clear at the first glance that this is what's happening, but I think a little bit of patience with the text does show it's there. So on the first count, Eve is alone. And so moving into what Augustine calls the private domain immediately brings to mind this sort of lack of difference.
Interesting.
And then Eve is standing in front of a symbol of androgyny, namely the tree. So within Jewish culture, the tree is androgynous. Actually, all the trees in the garden are androgynous. And this is how we basically understand trees to be today still, or plants generally, is having the male and the female within one organism. And so she stands in front of it. And what does she do there under this symbol of androgyny? Well, she usurps what you might crassly call the gender role of the male. Because, again, I'm not gonna justify it. I'm just gonna point to the tradition in which the man is considered to receive the law from God for the sake of its dissemination to all of creation. And what is the law? Well, right now it's just don't eat the fruit. And the woman receives the law from Adam. And then what happens that day under the androgynous tree? Well, the woman makes a new law, namely, I can't eat from this tree. And what does she do? She disseminates it to Adam. And Adam, paradoxically, enters into the mode of the female. So he receives the law and is obedient. And so under the tree, you have this, it's a very sort of beautiful, complex description, but man and woman are both envying each other's roles and seeking to undo precisely that which shows that they're not God, namely their sexual difference. And so what happens? Well, they eat the fruit, they fall. And what's the first thing they do? They look at each other and they are no longer naked without shame. Now you got to remember, well, what is nakedness? nakedness is fundamentally the revelation of creaturely insufficiency each to the other. So they're without shame because it doesn't signify anything other than that which they rejoice in, their non-divinity. And so the mutual signifying of non-divinity each to the other is part of the whole joy of Eden. But at the moment you say, I would like to be like God, I want to get over this, then what does that same nakedness signify? It's not like it changes in its shape. The fathers are very mysterious on this. Adam and Eve lose garments of light. They lose, and this is interpreted in many different ways, garments of virtue, I think is the best one. But they look at each other's nakedness, and now it signifies precisely their failure to get what they wanted. So now nakedness signifies, oh, yep, you're still creatures. The light God thing, sicut Deus, nope, sorry, didn't happen. So now the relationship is one of the pagan myths. So after God calls them to account, the first thing Adam does is blame Eve for all the woes that he is about to undergo. And so you see that only in the sort of lie of idolatry did they achieve any kind of androgyny. In fact, what you achieve whenever you go for androgyny is sexual difference in antagonism, which is simply to say you can't actually become like God in this way. All you can do is start being mean to women. This might seem funny, but I think it actually describes Greek culture.
Yes.
Where you want divinity, you cannot get divinity because your very flesh says I am insufficient. And so you look upon this flesh in such a way as to essentially ignore or destroy woman as a signifying reality, which is why Greek culture is as it is, where woman is basically annexed to the children and to slaves as objects of male sexual pleasure. And sex itself is kind of redefined as the kind of free male citizen activity of insemination, quite apart from procreation, which has its own. That's like the necessary thing that you kind of have to do to keep citizens coming.
Civic duty. Yeah.
But what you really want is a kind of sexual life in which woman is irrelevant, namely sexuality or pederasty or this sort of, I mean, Foucault writes very well about all this in his history of sexuality. So I won't go over it here. But the point is, under the tree that day, they want to be like God. There's no way to be like God except for to get beyond sex. And so they give it their best shot. And when they don't, then sex itself becomes a rebuke. That by which they celebrated their non-divinity now becomes the sort of sneer that, yeah, you are still not divine. So what do? Well, they cover themselves. But with what? With leaves of the androgynous tree. And when Adam hides from God out of fear, it says he hides among the trees of the garden again. So you have this, as it were, descent into the kind of would-be androgyny of plant life. Of course, it's opposed because all idolatry is opposed. I mean, at the end of the day, all idolatry is a covering of sexual difference with plant leaves, right? You know what I mean? Like it just,
that's a T-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The way to do it is to take something which is in fact not God, and then to cover its not godness in such a way as people believe you, right? That's simple enough. But the point is that with man, that can only be the covering up of sexual difference. That has to be annexed to some problem, some fall, something that's not really real, a secondary characteristic of being, something that's certainly not concomitant with creation, right? So the fall attempts to enact androgyny. It can't do it. And there's this rule, or what's the word? There's a I'll just call it a rule. There's a rule of theology that Bonaventure expresses really well, and I'm not going to express it very well, but I'm going to give it a shot. Which is namely that which is rejected as a gift returns as a law. So if you reject it, something in the order of grace, you don't actually get beyond. You don't defeat grace. That's stupid. Grace is going to get you. You reject something on the order of grace, you receive it in the order of law. And of course, this is precisely what happens to man and woman, right? What do they reject? They reject sexual difference as a gift. They reject it as signifying that non-divinity. The woman rejects her primal vocation as the destroyer of would-be divinity in man, which, by the way, is why the devil tempts her. You ever wondered about this? Like, why is Eve the object here? Yeah. I've always been dissatisfied with this, like, late
kind of Greek answer, actually.
Well, yeah, it comes from there where they're like, well, woman is by nature the most lustful and fleshy and passionate, and it's like, really?
Yeah. Yeah, no.
Yes, you guys, maybe it's different. I don't know. I just like if you were gonna be like, all right, you're the devil, pick the lusty, passionate one. I don't know, man. Like times change, I get that, but it doesn't seem immediately like satisfying as an answer. And I think what's much more satisfying as an answer, and in some ways, that idea of like a particular female passion can be incorporated into this answer. So I'm not like denying what the fathers have said here.
Mm.
Is just that woman had a mission.
Mm-hmm.
Her mission, actually. I mean, we sometimes there's this evangelical interpretation that I think is kind of unhelpful, which is like Adam's mission is to protect the garden, and the devil is this Leviathan, and he gets into the garden. So it's really Adam's fault that, like, he's left alone. And it's, I think, an attempt to be feminist or something. I'm not sure actually what's going on there, so I'm not going to speak. But what I think is much clearer from the text as it's given is that woman has a primary vocation to signify non-divinity. So of course you have to destroy the woman in order to destroy the man. It works that way. Yeah,
and hence the importance of Mary. But sorry, go ahead, because she destroys the Leviathan. Yeah,
I don't think about that fact that what happens in the proto-evangelion is that after they go for this whole androgynous idolatry, and God gives them hope precisely in the victory of a future woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so important because sometimes, like, the Christological desire is to just annex it to Christ and say, because Christ is who saves, and that's true. It's Christ who saves, but it's not like, if that was all the proto-evangelium was trying to say, it would sure be a lot clearer to just say that, like, and not kind of mix it up with the woman. And her.
Well, there's a fascinating ambiguity in that text. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. Is it the seed of the woman, or is it the woman?
Right. Yeah.
But I think that ambiguity is in fact what's being taught there, which is that when the primary mission and meaning of the woman as such is lost for the sake of primal androgyny, then only a woman can bring redemption in the way that it's brought. But of course, it can only be brought through Christ. So
exactly.
Okay, but what I wanted to argue though is that the nope, no, I've lost it actually.
The fall, the woman is the one that is attacked because of her mission.
Yeah, I think that was my tangent. Actually, that's what really.
Well, it was excellent. Let's see. Well, I guess let's see. So we're at an hour and a half. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. Honestly, it's fascinating. Maybe what we'll do is I'll wrap this up by asking you a flippant question, which is basically, Mark, what is gender?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things to note. It is true, as many great Catholic thinkers have pointed out, that gender is sort of a suspect term. I don't think it's as suspect as they think, and I'm being kind of pious here, I guess, but like the popes use it, and always with recommendations that we don't like make hardline distinctions between sex and gender and such, but they're still willing to sort of discuss it. Okay, so in the modern context, gender basically means your subjective appropriation of sex. So you have your sex, and then gender is your the psychological appropriation of that fact. So you might say sex is a biological reality, and then gender is a psychological reality, whereby the biological reality is actually part of me, part of my identity. And I don't think drawing that distinction is necessarily wrong. I mean, that seems to be in some ways real. Like, I wouldn't limit it to the biological reality, but I'd say there's a subjective appropriation of an objective mode of our creation that is in some ways distinct by virtue of being like my psychological appropriation of this fact. Okay. All that being said, I think that there already was a certain equivalent to the sex gender distinction, or at least there should be, which is this distinction between the being of woman, being a man, and then the vocation of them, which is to say that like sex cannot be reduced to its brute facticity,
Mm-hmm.
which is why and we know that, which is why we bother reading Genesis, is because our experience of the facticity of sex, as we said at the beginning, leads us to wonder. And then we ask, why am I this way? And the mere reception of the sex other doesn't satisfy yet, because it's precisely our wonder of our status vis-a-vis the sex other that made us question it in the first place. I don't think that Catholics properly understand how they're often not answering the question. And people are asking, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And then you're pointing to the other sex and saying, look, you're complementary with that, right? And it's like, no, that's where we start. That's the starting question. It's like, I have noticed and am freaked out by the fact that I am both different and for the other. That's where the crisis is. That's where you then start.
Yeah.
And I worry that a lot of our efforts at sort of answering the questions are in fact answering different questions that we're presupposing exist in the minds of sort of modern people right now.
Yeah.
You know, like the presumption is like, how what's the significance of biological difference, or you know, I don't know. I get this way with the Thomists a lot, because like they're doing what they should do, which is trying to work out the metaphysical distinctions. Like, is gender an accident, or is it a proper accident? Does it belong to the substance? Blah, blah, blah. But whatever answer you come up with, it's not the thing that makes people go, oh, finally, now I get it. What is a man? Don't worry, I've got you, buddy. Man is a proper accident. Oh, thank God. Now I can, not consider the surgery where I'm about to like remove my anatomy. It's like that is not quite the question, although it is, of course, a necessary investigation. I hope to contribute to it. Okay, so to your question, what is gender? I mean, I think that it is a loosey-goosey category that has been weaponized to basically promote the idea that gender is not created, that it is a secondary characteristic, like we've been speaking of. But I also constructed. But I also think that, as we've discussed with the conservative arguments, that sex is also weaponized to that same end, and that if we think that by ceasing to sort of make gender the point of discussion and sort of harping on sex as a biological reality, if that's all we mean by it, which I'm not saying, a lot of people don't mean quite that, but if that's all we mean by it, we're not doing ourselves any favor. So what I'd say is gender is an attempt to answer the meaning of the sexual difference that faces us. It doesn't simply say, okay, I know that how to recognize a woman. I know the things that express the being of a woman. But what I want to know is, what is a woman? What is she for? What do I do as a man who and I think those questions go to the heart of it. And I think gender can be a useful tool in sort of just distinguishing, like, look, I'm not talking just about your biological makeup. Though, of course, Dom, I have to say, like, it's sort of a circular argument, right? Because, or not a circular argument, that's bad, but an argument that by departing, as it were, from sex to ask questions about idolatry actually goes back to the physical procreative structure of the human person as being male or female. And again, this is like as much a part of the Jewish tradition as anything else. And I think it should become more a part of the Christian tradition. And there's a lot of people like Schindler kind of thinking in this way, namely that the way that we are procreative is itself the way that we rejoice in being creaturely. And in some ways, you can't imagine it being otherwise. Like, what is sex? Sex is the revelation of each to the other in their complete difference beyond any deniability. And then that is the precise moment at which a new creation is possible. Like, if you're God and you're going to say, okay, I want to create new human beings, it seems to me very reasonable to say the very moment at which I create new human creatures is precisely when the objective significance of their act is rejoicing in creatureliness. No matter how perverse that act can become, and indeed, I think it's made perverse precisely for the sake of denying its significance as a liturgy of celebrating creatureliness. But it's the very moment at which, I mean, people speak poetically about this, right? Like that in the procreative act, man and woman offer up our flesh to God to create a new human being. It's very important to remind ourselves that human beings do not reproduce. It's not what we do. That's what animals do. They reproduce a species, right? But man offers up his and her flesh for the creation, for the creator, in order to, to say yes, as it were, to the creation of a new human person. But what that means is that sexual difference as a procreative reality is still a anti-idolatrous reality. That is to say, the act of sex itself is this liturgy of, and when I say liturgy, I mean like in its objective structure, right? Because I get that subjectively you might not be there. But in its objective structure, it is saying it is very good that we are not God. This is what I think it means to have sex, is to say it's good that I'm not God. And precisely at that moment is the moment when human flesh is disposed to God as creator. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah, no, I think that's what you're saying.
So
yeah, no. So in other words, there isn't a very easy answer, but there is a kind of holistic approach to the question, which is gender, in a certain sense, is that which makes the person possible, right? So and the body is that which expresses that possibility in a world, right? A world being a field of relations, I guess, is what I'm thinking. Okay. So the way I see it is that gender is what makes the sacrament of the person possible. So I'm thinking more of John Paul II, and everything you were saying reminded me constantly, going back to his theology of the body, of this. He talks about the two different incarnations of what it means to be a human person. But you need differentiation for personhood to be possible. You need the other, but it's also it's the lower is participating in the higher and making the higher present among us because of our bodies. So you can't divorce sex and gender, but they're not the same thing, and it's a participation in God. It's being in His image because it's the possibility for the visibility of the gift. You see what I'm saying? That's kind of how I've answered. My friends have asked me, what is gender? It's kind of like the John Paul II answer, which is, well, it's the possibility of being a person in a visible way.
Yeah, one of the things that John Paul has said that maybe this helps with your definition there is that there's this obviously classic question in the tradition of, in the resurrection, will we have sexual organs? Like, will we be sexually differentiated? And overwhelmingly, the tradition has answered yes. You're created as a man or a woman, you rise as a man or a woman. But then the question is, well, then are our organs superfluous? Not simply our genitals, but everything that makes us procreative and child rearing, are these superfluous? And John Paul says, and I think this is really the only possible answer, is that no, because in the resurrection, the fullness of their meaning is revealed.
Yes.
And that meaning transcends the procreative meaning, but transcends in a very important sense. Like, I don't mean transcends as in leaves behind. I mean what procreation is more perfectly known in its transcendence in heaven than it is here on earth. And so the point is that we are dealing with a profound mystery here. And the effort to get away from the mystery, which will be fully revealed in the resurrection, and to consider it as something that has no mystery, has no transcendence, but can be reduced and exhausted in a description of function or part, is to simply leave behind the Christian achievement and to start taking up a foreign, I think, ideology. Because one thing that I'm really convinced of is that this view that there are men and women and that is good is not something we get by the easy exercise of our natural reason. At least historically, this has not seemed to be the case. But that means that this promulgation of the Torah, the law, where it says male and female he created them, means that the whole story of salvation, where Israel becomes the church, the whole story of salvation is also the story by which that doctrine becomes comprehensible to us as we look around. Like it doesn't take any effort for me to look around and say, there's men and there's women, and it's good that there's both. Something nice,
Right.
nice and easy peasy. 1950s about it, right? But the point is, but that wasn't something that we just got. That's something that we worked for. That's something that the Israelite army fought for and died for, and it's something that comes with the spread of Christianity and so the gospel, and it's still true today. If you look at unevangelized places, you tend to get the same kind of mythic thinking that
that's also why sometimes I'm kind of annoyed at people who say, well, look, it's obvious. Like, the kind of conservative argument, which is, people are completely insane. I don't know. I think people are just following through the logic of a new paganism. It's not that insane.
Exactly.
I mean, it is, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you're quite right. I think that people are not being crazy. They have been deprived of revelation, in the sense of being deprived of the scripture itself, for sure, but also the revelation that is affected in the life of the church. Again, we go back to that point about gendered worlds being the way in which man is known to himself, woman is known to herself. This isn't merely and I mean, this is a tough argument to make, because on some level, the human family is always the church, even before the church. Like there's massive questions of a certain supernaturality of the family.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of impinging on the discussion. So I'm caveating here, because I think a full analysis would have to say that something like the gospel of revelation is always present in marriage, the one blessing not effaced by the fall. I mean, that is obviously relevant here.
Yeah. That gets into debates over nature and grace, and that's
I don't want to do
tricky territory. Yeah.
Where you stand on, you have to do research. But the naturalness by which we see man and woman as being alike in dignity, being both different and yet both created, what that reality of revelation, the thing that was revealed to us in the scriptures, was reinforced and revealed again and again in the very way that we were living.
Mm-hmm.
So when those two sources of revelation, I'd call one tradition and one scripture, when those two sources of revelation are obscured, then it's no surprise that you get a people that floundering around for an answer as to, hey, I've noticed. I mean, because it's a mystery that presents itself to every generation, right? This is what's so incredible about humanity, is that we never really attain anything. We always start again, right? So the new generation, raised in its new habits, is once again looking at the wondrous nature of sexual difference and casting about for an answer, but now cut off from tradition and scripture that says male and female, you created them. It's left to a certain extent its own resources, or rather the resources of the anti-Christianity, which is called liberal capitalism, or just liberalism, right? And what liberalism provides is an alternative anthropology to answer your question. What is a man? What is a woman? They are two variations on a common human type that should strive to a kind of equality of existence, precisely because they are fundamentally and at base equal.
Yeah. Oh, Mark, you're muted. Shows that you're muted. Can't hear you. I wonder what happened. Well, in the meantime, we got a question here from can't pronounce your name, Jorsalayam. I'll go ahead and ask Mark when he gets back. The wonders of technology. Mark, maybe you just clicked on the mute button on the screen. Is that possible? What's awesome is that YouTube allows you to cut out any kind of gaps in post production. Oh, we're back.
Nailed it.
Got it. Awesome.
Sorry.
What's awesome is
all that
that
had happened was that my mic was unplugged, but then I overthought it.
No, that's fine. What's awesome about
I was about to go off
YouTube?
on another rant, and it was really the Lord in His mercy was just like, Mark, in the 2-hour mark. We're done.
No, you're fine. You're fine. So someone had a question for you, Mark, and then we'll end with this. What does Mark think about patristic perspectives, for example, that of St. John Chrysostom or St. Augustine, etc., on gender and the sacrament of marriage? Will New Polity cover the fathers in the future?
Well, that's depends on what you mean by all the words in the sentence. Which I'll answer what I think is being asked, which is that there's apparently like in Augustine especially, a very thorough discussion of the fall, of the creation of man and woman, of the meaning of concupiscence, of and it seems like in some ways what I'm saying here at least needs to reckon with this as being a pretty complete account, right? Like you don't just get to say this and then Augustine sort of, read it if you want, I guess. What I really do think that what I'm saying is Augustine. I think what I'm adding to it is a perspective he already had, and I'm just drawing it out, namely that man, in desiring to be like God, lowers himself to the beasts. So Augustine, for instance, does interpret the whole nakedness of man differently than I do, by saying, that in disobedience to God, man's own bodily nature is in disobedience to his spiritual nature. So the spiritual nature is supposed to order the flesh. And so when but it orders the flesh precisely by being itself ordered by obedience to God, right? So when man shakes off the obedience to God thing, then he no longer has dominion over his own flesh. And so genital arousal for the first time becomes something that comes upon him, as it were, from outside, as opposed to being proper to his will.
Mm-hmm.
To say, so there is this whole theology there.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I was gonna say I think St. Maximus the Confessor actually says something very similar.
And Aquinas takes up Augustine pretty much without really shifting anything, and I just think it's correct. But I do think that within this, and this is just to give an instance, right? Because obviously I'm not going to respond here about like the entirety of the Augustinian sort of corpus here, but to give an instance to show that I think that we're actually in continuity here. Augustine says that genital arousal results from the fall in this manner. And what I'm trying to take into account is that idea that what is rejected in the order of grace returns in the order of law, because Augustine calls genital arousal the law of the flesh, and it does seem to have biblical support for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not that arousal is bad, right? It's that now what was once received in grace must come upon man. I mean, think about this, because I think that the trouble we get with Augustine is that we think of man as becoming more sexual after the fall, when it's obvious to me in reading Augustine that he becomes less sexual. Because the punishment that he receives is precisely that now you have to reveal the very sexual difference that you would hide under those leaves But now you're going to do it by a kind of coercion, whereas once you did it in freedom, right? So sexual arousal coming upon one, as opposed to an act of the will, signifies that God is moving man to reveal himself in his insufficiency, whereas once he rejoiced in that insufficiency and so didn't need the law to make him do what now he won't do. And this, I think, describes sexual arousal very well today. I mean, Augustine, when he's describing it, he talks about sexual arousal being a sort of sign of man's silliness, his folly. Like when he wants it to be there, it's not there, and when he doesn't want it to be there, it is there, because he is as the beasts in a certain respect, that it moves through him now. God attains the ends proper to man, not in freedom, but in coercion. Of course, this isn't strictly true all the way, because there's obviously enough freedom there to use genital arousal. Like we're still within the dialectic of humanity here. We don't actually become like the beasts, which is why in the story of the fall, man is the one who would be an androgen, descending all the way to the level of the plants, denying his sexual difference. But God is the one who clothes man, who covers up that original nakedness, but now in the garments of skin, which Augustine takes to be a symbol for the law of the flesh. Precisely because now that man faces death, now that he can, in a certain respect, imitate animal sexuality, because now he reproduces out of a sort of necessity, right? Like, you're going to die, so now the species is only going to work through you, as it were, whereas once you freely constituted the species. And so there's an imitation of animal sexuality. Of course, it's not reduced to animal sexuality, because man is still free. And man can feel shame now over his very, like animals don't feel shame because they are in fact reproducing a species, but man is always offering up his flesh for a new creation. So when he has to do that in the manner of the animals, there's shame, there's difficulty with it. Okay, all of which is to say that I think that the Augustinian tradition is very compatible here, and it's just a matter of thinking through causes sometimes a little differently. Like I see genital arousal primarily not as a source of shame, but as a way of attaining what sexual difference attained in freedom now under the law, which I'm pretty sure is just what Augustine thinks. I just think it has a weird reading as like a sexual fall thing. That
I mean, and the language is different. I mean, I was actually reading an article called it was about contraception is actually anti-erotic.
Yeah.
So, and I think John Paul makes a distinction between his sexuality, which is fully expressive, and a diminutive concupiscence. And I think that's what Augustine is on to, basically. It's just the language he's using. I think we just use words differently, but it's the same idea. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, it has been 2 hours, Mark. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know we could talk for, about all this stuff for a lot more, but I'll have to make some clips here of this wonderful conversation. Thank you for. Oh, hey, Jacob.
What's up, brother, man? How you doing?
Hey, how you doing? Doing good. You?
Yeah. Sorry. Resist,
Good to see you. All right. Well, with that being said, audience, make sure you like this video, make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment down below. And if you enjoy this type of content, these conversations, support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And Mark, any parting words?
Just go out there and get that bread, boys.
Wonderful. And we'll see you guys next time.